News Ahead.
Well, joining me this morning, Mike Indian, political journalist and commentator, and Will Kingston, political commentator from The Spectator. Good morning to the two of you.
Good morning.
Good day, David.
What about that? I mean, I've been asking the question this morning, you know, all of these political parties promised stuff before the election. Labour never promised anything that they now are delivering. And that voice note that we just heard from M, what is the point of voting? What is the point of voting, Mike?
Well, that's a deep question for a Saturday morning.
Well, surely that's the whole point, isn't it? The political parties lay out their smorgasbord of offerings and they need to stick to it. They can't have all of these policies squirreled away. They suddenly enact because there's no mandate to do that.
Well, this is the trouble with our system, is that we expect parties to stick to their manifestos over a 5-year period. And Labour ran on a very minimalist approach. You know, they ran on a manifesto designed, I think it was called the Ming Vase strategy, not to spook people as well. And once they're in government, they're twisting and turning to try and realise it in the end. And the Employers' National Insurance is a great example of this as well. They can argue it's not technically a tax on working people, but the OBR expects that to feed through into the labour market capacity. I know Will's itching to come in.
Well, come on then.
I would have hoped they'd stick to it over 5 years, but at the very least, stick to your manifesto over 100 days.
Yeah,
you know, they've already gone back on tax. They've already gone back on a range of different things. And it was such odd political cowardice because they were going to win no matter what against that Tory government. They could have actually made some bold promises because they were going to win this election. That's what I don't understand. It points just rubbish politics.
Well, and also we can't even corroborate the 20 billion hole. She's raised taxes by 40 billion. You're right, they've kept to the spirit of it. No increase in income tax, national insurance, VAT, corporation tax. But actually, I think it was duplicitous.
Yeah, people can smell that sort of duplicity and that sort of sophistry, which has come from the Labour Party. People aren't stupid. But I think that the big thing here for Starmer is that his central political thesis was around growth. And no country in human history has ever taxed their way to growth. This isn't a growth budget. At least be honest and say this is about redistribution or saying this is about fixing the public services. But why would you come out and say this is about growth and then not have a single growth-initiated measure?
How much of this was thought through? So the big story this morning, GPs hit by national insurance raid could get compensation. So they haven't thought about this. The Employers' National Insurance, right, which has gone up, is going to hit care homes. It's going to hit GPs. These are independent businesses. I do not believe for one moment anyone in the Treasury actually worked that out.
Well, this is the longest gap between a general election and a budget, certainly in recent history. 3.5, almost 4 months. So you'd hope they'd have thought it all through by now. But of course, as we know, remember the omnishambles budget back in 2013, there's lots of consequences which the Treasury doesn't foresee. Just on Will's growth point, the OBR forecasts that this budget will boost growth by 0.5% of GDP in 2025-26.
Whoopie-doo.
But the key line in their assessment is that this will only be the measures in this budget will only be longitudinally beneficial to the UK economy if the level of investment is maintained. Come back to the fact the IFS has identified £9 billion a year additional revenue needed in tax. Rachel Reeves needs to keep up this investment and levels of tax increases per year for the rest of the Parliament. That only pays off for them if the economy is growing and public services are improving.
It only also pays off if their sums are right. And Georgie was talking about this morning. They are not going to raise the levels of money they say they will raise because their calculations are fundamentally flawed.
No, that's right. I wouldn't trust this government with those sorts of calculations at the best of times. But the other thing is as well, it takes a unique type of political stupidity to be able to borrow that amount of money, to spend that amount of money, and then come out with a growth forecast from the OBR that is less than what they would have done if it was, say, a Tory government, which still wasn't great. But it just goes to show that this isn't about growth, it is about redistribution, and that's something which is really depressing.
Isn't this about being a Labour government?
But this is the other thing. They had this mask of technocratic managerialism through Starmer, and they were trying to come across as non-ideological, and then they get into government, and you realise that this is closer to an old-school 1970s Labour socialist government than it is to that sort of technocratic managerialism, which still wasn't great under the Tories, but it's a heck of a lot less better or worse than it would have been.
So actually, you mentioned the 1970s there. I think this is an article from the Spectator, actually, which says that Rachel Reeves is taking us back to the 1970s. You know, tax rises, increased borrowing, a bigger state, spending on public services accompanied with without the reform that they need. I mean, also chucking money at the NHS. This is obviously my specialist subject. Chucking that kind of money, 20 billion at a 176 billion problem becomes a 196 billion pound problem with no reform.
The issue, I mean, look, I was disappointed to see that they rode back so quickly on their tough talk on reform. And, you know, we're going to get the NHS 10-year plan in the spring. Meaningful changes to how the NHS is run, particularly tough decisions about what it actually does and does not do. The bit in this budget that I did approve of was the increased capital investment. You know, Boris Johnson didn't deliver, for example, the extra hospital spending that we saw this day, which you'll be very aware of the state of many GP surgeries, for example. The NI thing on GPs is a very interesting point because it also underlies a particularly difficult question about how Labour wants to treat people that have a public-private relationship with the NHS going forward. They promised to fix the gateway of primary care, but if GPs are going to be laying people off and having to leave the profession, then they're going to need to press ahead more of their salaried intention to bring more GPs into that so they're exempt from the NI increase in the first place.
But you can't then raise employer national insurance and then go, oh no, apart from... It sounds like a Monty Python sketch. Well, apart from the GPs, oh, what about care homes? Oh, apart from care homes, you know, doesn't it?
Yeah, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Yeah, what have the Romans ever done?
What has the Labour Party ever done for us? Not bloody much. The issue here is that
it's a little fruity and for that language this morning.
Apologies, yes. It's an Australianism.
You can't help that.
Official apology to Ofcom. The issue is, and this cuts across both education and health, is that the most basic thing that this government doesn't seem to understand is that if you take money away from the private sector and if you take away incentives to enter the private sector, more people will go to an already crumbling public sector, which is why you're going to see kids coming out of private schools and you're going to see people leaving private GP surgeries and going into overloaded hospitals, plus care homes into the mix as well. This is the problem, and you can see that this is a government that just doesn't have any experience in the private sector. They literally don't. It's painfully obvious.
We were talking earlier with Georgie Frost about the markets, financial markets turned on Rachel Reeves on this budget. You know, when I was saying I was on the way to a funeral of all things, listening to the budget, and which was pretty apt.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the loss as well.
But my initial reaction was, because I think it had been so highly briefed about all these changes, it wasn't as bad as I expected. And it wasn't until I looked at the detail, and the devil is in the detail, I realised how catastrophic this budget is.
I mean, look, we're seeing the benefits here of the pre-briefing that happened as well. I think the big surprise on the day was the reduction in the NI threshold. For many businesses, that was a bigger tax
from
increase.
9,500 to 5,000.
That's actually a bigger cost for most businesses than... This is where the impact on things like care homes comes from, because it brings a lot of lower paid workers inside the scope of the NI change as well. And this is where the tortuous language about working people becomes a bit more of an issue, though. But for context, the 0.05% increase in, 10-year gilts that we saw this year was a fraction, a tenth of what we saw with Liz Truss. And, of course, that reinforces the message that, comms, getting your budget pre-briefed is always a good thing as well.
Which we know she failed.
And it's funny, I mean, look, Will, I said before, what's Labour ever done for this country? I could list the NHS, the welfare state, I could list abolishing the death penalty, the abortion penalty, devolution.
You can't hang your hat on 1948.
I can hang my hat on many things. Devolution, the Freedom of Information Act, national minimum wage.
Devolution, don't start me on devolution.
I could keep going. Record levels of public sector investment. The point is that Rachel Reeves did do this was an authentically Labour budget, and they've made a choice here.
But Will's point is valid, isn't it? Which they should have been honest with us and said, we are reverting to type being a Labour government, we're going to tax the heck out of you.
If they wanted to tax the heck out of people, they'd have undone the unfunded national insurance cuts that Jeremy Hunt
couldn't, because they'd boxed themselves into a corner.
They also didn't keep the income tax freeze beyond 2028 as well, which for many people in 5 years' time will be a big relief, because that convention of tax thresholds not rising has been the single biggest stealth tax. It was a Conservative stealth tax as well.
Just before an election as well, conveniently.
But I was going to say, Will, how much of this is naivety, because they did box boxed themselves into a corner. National insurance, VAT, corporation tax won't go up. Now, as you say, the employer's NI was a glaringly obvious one, but they had very little wiggle room from those, and as Georgie said, from the majority of the tax raising issues that they could have gone after. So they were duplicitous.
There's two things going on here, David. There is political cowardice. They were just too afraid to be honest, despite the fact that even if they were honest, they still would have won. But there's another thing here, and that is, and this cuts across the Tories and the Labor Party, is this country has forgotten how to grow. It's forgotten how to actually encourage the private sector to stimulate the economy. Instead, it's just easier to raise taxes or to borrow. The Tories were just a less bad version of that formula. And unless we learn how to stimulate the private sector and change our fundamental economic model, this country's heading for bankruptcy.
And this is what many people are saying. Paul in Fife says Labour ministers have no experience of the private sector. Yeah. Isn't that why government have advisors? Does this government not only have the biggest bunch of incompetence in charge, they don't even appear to have people with experience to give appropriate advice. Going back to your point about the SMEs, they're the backbone of this country's economy. Yeah. To start a company, you have to have vision and drive. You put your own cash in it. Yeah. And now you're being fleeced the other end. Why would you bother?
I think this is the problem, that Labor frames business as if it's the FTSE 100. It frames it as the top end of town, the News Corps of this world who are evil capitalists.
Or any other company.
Exactly right. And then you forget that the backbone of the economy are those small businesses, mum and pop shops, and they're the ones that really get hit hard by these sorts of tax increases. And they're the ones that ultimately, when you see kind of areas like GP surgeries, when you see areas like care homes, they're the ones where it's going to be counterproductive for the types of people that the Labor Party claims to care so much about.
So there was a really interesting point when she said she wasn't going to raise duty on beer, and I thought, well, that's a good thing. But of course,
classic Labour move. That.
It's a classic Labour move,
classic
but also
Labour
she's
move.
going to hammer the pubs with the employers' NI.
Yeah, that's right. We get a penny for
a you
pint.
get a penny back.
I was trying to work out how many pints I'd need to drink to save for my one year.
I mean, we mustn't also forget the fact that, talk about absurd Labour announcements. The smoking ban on pub gardens they've rowed back on that now as well.
Of course they have.
So pub, look, I'm not going to argue the first 100 days of the Starmer government has been an overwhelming success. It hasn't. It has been a chaotic dog's breakfast. But the one thing we have to remember...
But it's your chaotic dog's breakfast.
There are two areas which haven't yet been factored into the long-term economic forecast. Planning reforms, which they're hanging their hats on that a lot as well.
Yes, because they're going to pave over all the farms, aren't they? Because there won't be any farms.
They want to build lots of pylons. And the other one is, of course, the employers' rights changes as well, which the OBR is cautious about in that assessment as well. And bear in mind that anything from the government forecast, we don't talk about the OBR because of its reliability, we talk about it because of the bearing it has on the political narrative.
So let's also talk about private schools, because more than 1,000 private schools are going to sue the government en masse over the VAT raid on fees. This is the Independent Schools Council announced that its members have now voted in favour of launching the High Court action. 1,400 private schools. They've hired Lord Panic, who is a leading human rights barrister, to spearhead the legal challenge. Essentially, they are trying to prove that Labour's policy undermines the pupils' human rights under the ECHR, that old chestnut, and the Human Rights Act of 1998. Meanwhile, the secondary story here is those parents, and this is what annoys me, those people who work two jobs, who don't go on holiday, who send their kids to a public school, are trying desperately to work out what they do with this VAT, because it means their kids will come out of those private schools and there is no provision in the state sector for them. So some of them have paid the fees up front to try and avoid that VAT, and now the government has said, we're going after you.
The comparative amount of money raised by this is so small
as well.
It is. And it was a political decision to do this, and I think at the end of the day, you have to judge it on outcomes too. Why did they do it? If states, well, for Labour, it's easy to bash private schools. They're taking away the VAT.
Even though they send their kids to private schools.
Well, a lot of them do, yes.
They do.
Yeah, that's right. As an aside, I like names that reflect the moment. Lord Panic is very apt for this situation. Dr. Bull, potentially, as well.
Thank you very much.
The fact of the matter is, more than any other measure, this attack on private schools is reflective of dogma, as opposed to actually any sort of practical benefit.
And also halfway through the school year.
It's just actually quite cruel. I think this is the other thing, and that the Labor Party traditionally has branded itself around kindness and compassion, and yet so many of these measures are needlessly cruel. And if I was the incoming Conservative leader, I'd be making hay on this sort of measure, that this is not a Labor Party that really cares about people.
This is a message from Annette Brown. Hi, David. I think inheritance tax was brought in the 1970s. It was brought in to tax the super rich who had estates. The figure was set at 300,000. The figure does not seem to have risen. There are now many houses, certainly here in the south, worth well over that figure. Ordinary family homes. The figure that inheritance starts at needs to be raised significantly. In fact, modern inheritance tax dates back to 1894 when the government introduced estate duty, a tax on the capital value of land. It's a fair point, though, isn't it? The inheritance tax threshold is woefully low.
I mean, they've frozen it again for the few years, and one of the more interesting things that happened was the agricultural land relief in this budget was also abolished, which means that farming is, I mean, bearing in mind that there isn't a lot of money in farming at the moment, DEFRA's budget for the coming year has been frozen in real terms as well. It's actually a real terms cut. They've made difficult decisions to invest in capital spending. I've got to stop saying difficult decisions, everyone says that. But, interestingly, for the farming sector in the UK, that's already had a tough year since Brexit, has already had to deal with the pandemic as well.
Yeah.
The main assets there are the land. So you can see that Labour is apparently going to look to invest more in, say, renewable energy sites, so more solar panels on agricultural land as well.
Of course they are.
But if we want to improve food security as well, we are going to need agricultural land to grow.
Do you think the Labour politicians who live in the city understand where food is grown?
The short answer is no. I don't. I doubt they've been out to many of these areas which actually, you know, put the salads in the Pretz that they kind of attend in Westminster.
But this is the point about the post July election map, is that we have many Labour MPs now, for example, in Suffolk Coastal, Jennifer Riddle Carpenter, that represent large agricultural areas for the first time. And this is why holding the Parliamentary Labour Party together, holding that voter coalition together over the next 5 years is going to be
so that's a brilliant point. 100 constituencies they now represent, which are rural
Yes, exactly. Labour MPs in rural areas.
So my neck of the woods, Suffolk Coastal, Mid-Suffolk, all of those, we are prime agricultural land. The farmers are livid because you make a good point. Farms are not making a lot of money. They're passed down from generation to generation. And if you have a bad year, you think, well, maybe we'll make it up next year, for example. Now, I understand that lots of people feel that it is unfair to hand over the farm free of inheritance tax. But capping it at £1 million makes no sense at all, because the farms are worth far more than that. £1 million farm wouldn't grow you many turnips.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, look, I've got a problem with inheritance tax.
So do
I. But if we're going to stick to the issue at hand, which is around farms, the big problem here is the one that you've hit on, David, and that is these are not lucrative businesses for the most part, and they're not liquid businesses. So if you're going to have to pay a £500,000 inheritance tax, you know, these farmers don't just have £500,000 in the bank ready to go. Most of the money is tied up in assets like machinery, like the land itself. So what you're going to have is you're going to have so many people who have run 6, 7 generation family farms who are forced to either sell a lot of those assets, which will lead to lower production, or they'll have to sell this land off full stop. And you know who they're going to sell it to? They're going to sell it to large-scale foreign investors. They're going to sell it to kind of, you know, large-scale farming asset management companies. And you're going to see these lovely old British family institutions die out. I think this is another tragedy, one of many in this budget.
So do I. I think also you'll get consolidation of farms. You'll have super farms, which is essentially exactly what people don't want in this country, because that is not the right way. I think there's another disconnect, isn't there, which is you've got Ed Miliband, who's desperate to put solar panels across the whole of this country, stick pylons across Suffolk and Norfolk and Essex. Again, I think it's because they don't understand the country.
I think underpinning all of this has been 14, 15 years of lack of investment here. And obviously, look, you know, the last government made a clear decision not to build onshore wind turbines as well. We're more obsessed now than we were at the start of the last government about security in general. So energy security, food security, and that means the country being more self-sufficient. We will never be able to grow enough food to feed ourselves. We will always need to import. We could become a net exporter of renewable energy as well, but it's all about the kind of stuff we do. Solar panels, I'm always a bit sceptical about. Personally, I'd prefer wind, tidal energy. You know, we're an island nation after all as well. Nuclear is a great option. We should be building more nuclear power stations around the country as well. I mean, there aren't many people that would want want that on their doorstep.
Well, why not?
But
We've
it
got
saves
size well A
secure
and B.
energy.
But also the point is we're a coastal, an island nation, so we have a lot of water to cool the PWR reactors.
The point is even more simple than that for me. The point is that this is all symbolic when it comes to net zero. It's not going to make an ounce of difference towards global emissions, which is fine if we had bucket loads of money to spend on virtue signalling symbolism. But we have people in this country that are really hurting. You said this fundamental issue, or what this comes down to, it comes down to choice. The choices that this Labor government have made have been around virtue signalling as opposed to around actually helping people struggling.
I'm quite like this article. This is in the Daily Mail. Rachel Reeves is facing a backlash over the tax hiking budget from her uncle, Terry Smith. He votes Tory. He says it's tax, tax, tax. He then goes banging on about the 22 billion hole, saying it's all
she
made up.
probably wrote the budget without her uncle in mind.
Yeah, well, I just thought that was great, there's disagreement.
What went wrong in that family? They're obviously on the right track, and then something happened, you know, in that kind of stage.
Well, and then Rachel Reeves' sister saying, I'm really proud of my sister delivering the budget. And, of course, there's been a lot of comments made about that.
Kudos to Terry.
Well, let's just talk about the Conservative the leadership campaign, because it's going to be announced in, just over 2 hours. You've got Robert Jenrick versus Kemi Badenoch. She is the favourite. I think it's bizarre they didn't have someone in place for the budget, personally, and I think they should have had. I think it's gone on far too long. The voting is low, turnout is low. They're saying Badenoch is going to win. I'm not quite so sure.
I think she will. But as an aside,
You do?
As an aside, it was actually Sunak's finest hour, that budget reply.
I would agree.
Where was that 2 years ago when it was actually needed? So he actually did very well. But that being said, I do think Badenoch will win. But I think this is also a really interesting insight into different political strategies, in that she's offered no policy.
None.
She said, I'm about principles, whereas Jenrick has been more technical in how he's looked at particular issues. And that's probably, and I think the principles point is probably smarter, because you avoid some of the issues that the Labor Party are currently falling into.
So also, the turnout is down. Also, that a lot of Conservatives are shy voters. They won't tell you how they voted. It is a secret ballot, obviously. Also, just in terms of the technology, a lot of them have been urged by emails and all the rest of it. If you've got an older population, I don't know how engaged they are with that. I don't think you can call it. And the Conservatives are notoriously good at having different results.
I'm fascinated to see what happens to the Tory party in this 5-year opposition period. Now, of course, I don't believe whoever's elected today will A, be the next Prime Minister, or B, even be leader in 2 years' time, maybe even 12 months' time. Kemi Badenoch probably will edge it, but...
Why not?
Well, I think we have to look at the fact that they're inheriting the worst position electorally the Conservatives have ever really had, 121 MPs. It doesn't take a lot to upset that party to have a vote of no confidence. And also, they have to decide which way they're going to tack. And both parties in that area, they tack to the right. They'll probably end up competing in the same areas of reform rather than moving back towards the red wall voters they wanted to try and seek in the first place. And Badenoch certainly is very culture war focused. She's certainly more likely to upset members of the Conservative Parliamentary Party as well. And most interestingly in this contest, James Cleverly, who was unexpectedly eliminated in the last round of MP voting, has said he's going back to the back benches. He's biding his time. He's waiting to see if they mess up so he can come in and then be the caretaker leader that they need.
I think this would be like the case in a normal political cycle. But we've already seen this is not a normal political cycle, and that the Labor Party is already falling behind in the polls. There's been literally no honeymoon period. I've never seen that in any Western
No, I haven't either. This is the poll in the Independent. Conservatives 29, Labour 28, which is interesting. Reform 17, down from 20, Lib Dems 13.
I tweeted last night, literally the most astonishing poll I have ever seen in Western politics in my lifetime.
What does it mean?
It means that the new leader of the Conservative Party will have more leeway and will have a longer period of time to be able to actually really fight.
Before they're
and so you're right. I would say normally this kind of Conservative leader that enters after being smashed in an election will find themselves out in 2 years.
William Hague did a full 4 years, though. I mean, it's more to do with Badenoch's personality and how she relates to her parliamentary colleagues. A lot of them don't like her.
I think the other question is whether Conservatives go back to or former Conservatives go back to the Conservative Party. Many of them have defected to Reform.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is. I take your point around her relationship with the Conservative Parliamentary Party.
But that Conservative Parliamentary she stays though.
Yeah, but they've failed. They've failed. Right. The real test will be how she actually connects with the electorate, and I think she's got a really great opportunity to do that. Particularly, she's being underestimated by almost everyone on the left.
Right.
I mean, she's an absolutely incredible intellectual powerhouse. It's going to be amazing to see a black woman leading a major UK political party as well. I'm fascinated to see how she does against Starmer in the PMQs
so much fun. She'll
next week.
brutalise him.
It will be very interesting. But I'm still going to stick to my bet that she will not be the Tory leader in 2 years' time.
Wow, some bet. Thanks ever so much. Mike Indian, Will Kingston. That was today's Head to Head.